Today's discussion brings together two figures central to Southern Africa's modern history. Cecil John Rhodes shaped the region through imperial expansion, capital, and control of land. Robert Mugabe shaped it through liberation politics and post-independence state power. Their ideas continue to influence how land, wealth, and authority are contested today. This debate does not seek moral judgment or historical apology. It seeks clarity through facts, consequences, and outcomes. Enjoy.
Let us begin with clarity. Land is not merely soil, it is leverage. Whoever controls land controls production, taxation, labor, and ultimately, law. This was true in the 19th century, and it remains true in the 21st. In my time, land in southern Africa was organized by charter, by company, by force, into productive systems. Mines produced capital. Farms fed labor. Infrastructure followed extraction. Wealth emerged not by accident, but by coordination. The injustice people now speak of is not mysterious. It is the predictable outcome of losing control over territory.
Your framing is efficient, I will give you that. But efficiency is not innocence. The land you describe as organized was taken, not purchased through consent, but seized through power. Africans did not lose control of land through incompetence. They were dispossessed through law written elsewhere, enforced by violence on the ground. At independence, Zimbabwe inherited an economy where a small minority owned most arable land, and the majority supplied labor without ownership. That arrangement was stable for investors, yes, but stability for whom?
Stability is always for someone. That is unavoidable. The question is not whether land was taken. History is rarely polite. But whether it was transformed into productive capacity. By the late colonial period, southern Rhodesia had commercial agriculture, export revenue, infrastructure, and integration into global markets. Land without systems produces subsistence. Land with systems produces surplus. Surplus funds states. You replaced one ownership class with another, but you disrupted the systems in between.
You speak as though systems descend from the sky. The systems you praise were designed to exclude Africans from ownership, capital, and decision-making. Education, finance, and credit were racially gated. Africans were expected to be productive for the system, not within it. At independence, we faced a choice: preserve an unjust structure for the sake of continuity, or correct it and accept disruption. We attempted gradual reform. It failed politically. Then came acceleration, with consequences, yes, but also with historical inevitability.
Inevitability is often the language leaders use when they abandon control. Fast-track land reform did not merely redistribute land. It dismantled confidence. Credit systems collapsed. Agricultural output fell. Capital fled. Currency credibility evaporated. Land does not generate wealth by symbolism. It generates wealth by rules. Clear tenure, enforceable contracts, predictable governance. Justice that destroys the mechanisms of production impoverishes the very people it claims to liberate.
And production that rests on inherited injustice corrodes legitimacy. You speak of capital flight. I speak of moral debt. A state that protects property rights rooted in dispossession becomes a custodian of theft. Over time, such a state loses authority in the eyes of its people. That erosion is slower than capital flight, but far more dangerous. You are correct about one thing. Redistribution without institutional discipline breeds chaos. But preservation without redistribution breeds revolt. Zimbabwe attempted to resolve a colonial contradiction within a post-colonial state. That is not a tidy process.
No revolution is tidy. But revolutions are not exempt from arithmetic. Once you break the expectation that property is secure, all property becomes political. Investors stop calculating returns and start calculating risk. Farmers stop investing. Banks stop lending. You speak of moral debt. Markets do not recognize moral debt. They recognize enforceability. That is not ideology. It is mechanics.
Markets also rely on legitimacy, though they prefer not to admit it. A society that views ownership as fundamentally unjust will not defend that system forever. Eventually, politics intervenes, sometimes through policy, sometimes through force. Your era externalized that reckoning. Mine confronted it. Perhaps the error was not redistribution itself, but allowing it to become a tool of patronage rather than reconstruction.
On that, we may agree more than expected. Land reform conducted through political loyalty, rather than institutional design, destroys both justice and productivity. It replaces one elite with another, while the system decays underneath. But let us be honest. Power, once centralized, rarely relinquishes itself voluntarily. That is not an African trait. It is a human one.
Let us speak of war then. Your empire expanded through conquest. Armed companies, treaties signed under pressure, borders drawn without consent. Violence was foundational, not incidental. Liberation movements arose because peaceful reform was structurally impossible. When law serves exclusion, resistance becomes rational. The war that brought independence was brutal, yes, but it was not arbitrary. It was directed at a system that denied political voice.
Empires are rarely invited, that is true. But empires also stabilize regions, suppress rival violence, and impose order where fragmentation prevails. The moral ledger of conquest is not one-sided. Your liberation war replaced imperial authority with national authority. But authority itself remained enforced by arms. The instruments changed. The structure persisted.
Authority always involves force. The difference lies in whose interests it serves. After independence, the state faced armed dissidents, regional instability, and Cold War pressures. The response in Matabeleland during the 1980s, what later became known as Gukurahundi, was severe, and its human cost remains contested and painful. History will judge whether it was security policy or political repression. What is undeniable is that violence did not end with independence. It merely changed uniforms.
An honest admission. Power tests restraint more than resistance ever does. Many leaders imagine that liberation grants permanent moral credit. It does not. Once in power, you are judged not by what you overthrew, but by what you build, and what you tolerate. Empires fall when they confuse control with legitimacy. So do revolutionary states.
And yet, former empires often lecture former colonies about restraint with selective memory. The United Kingdom in your era waged wars across continents to secure trade routes and suppress dissent. Modern states still deploy sanctions, financial pressure, and diplomatic isolation. Less visible tools, perhaps, but coercive nonetheless. Justice is rarely neutral. It is enforced by whoever defines order.
True. Power rarely announces itself as such. But there is a distinction worth preserving. Violence used to expand control, and violence used to maintain a state. Both are morally compromised, but they differ in consequence. A state that normalizes violence internally corrodes itself. Its institutions hollow out. Fear replaces trust. At that point, even victory becomes expensive.
Which is why states must eventually choose institutions over personalities. Zimbabwe did not fully make that transition. Power remained concentrated. Accountability weakened. Over time, the Liberation Party fused with the state itself. That fusion is difficult to reverse, especially when external pressure reinforces internal defensiveness.
Here is the irony history enjoys. Empires collapse because they overextend power without consent. Post-colonial states stagnate when they centralize power without constraint. Different origins, similar failures.
And similar consequences, citizens paying the price. Land reform promised dignity. War promised freedom. Neither automatically delivers prosperity or justice. Those require institutions that outlive leaders and restrain ambition, including my own.
Then perhaps the lesson is less ideological than structural. Land must be redistributed with rules. Justice must be pursued with limits. War may found states, but only law sustains them.
And wealth without inclusion becomes instability, just as justice without competence becomes poverty. History did not offer Zimbabwe easy options. It offered trade-offs. We chose some poorly. Others were constrained by inheritance. The tragedy is not that choices were made, but that systems were not rebuilt quickly enough to absorb them.
History rarely forgives delay.